Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Woodland Walk. Thank you for tuning in. And this is the month of Redwood in ASA. And the tree of Redwood is all about the themes of anxiety and safety and the dynamic between the two. So the redwood tree, this huge tree, which grows so big and wide with this very, very thick bark, still has at its core that very inner ring. If you look at a cross section of a tree, there are all those rings, one for every year of life. And the inner ring of the redwood tree is the sapling, the baby tree that is still there in the middle of that huge, huge trunk. And we think all about what it was like to be so little and so vulnerable as a tiny sapling, to have such thin skin in the forest, in the storms, not sure if it would survive. And then every year of life, the tree grows one ring until it has this very thick bark, but still our anxieties are there at the very core of ourselves. And in ASA, we work with the redwood around how we can really remember that we have this thick bark now. We have this safety, we have skills of regulation and co-regulation, we have resilience. But there is something that we're going to be talking today, and I have a very special guest with me who I'll introduce in a moment. We're going to be thinking about what happens when we live with that fear at our core and we stop taking risks and we kind of wrap ourselves up in blankets and maybe still don't feel better because there's something that we're missing. So the redwood tree is all about finding safety and soothing our fears. And then in ASA, a few months later, we come to the month of the apple tree, which is in August. And that is all about finding our purpose, connecting to our values, living our truest self, our truest life, what we were here for. And so today we're going to be thinking about what is the link between the redwood tree and the apple tree? What is the link between our fears, our core fears, and finding purpose? And now my guest today, John Hopkins, and that's John with an H, not Jon, the wonderful musician who often joins us in events. And John Hopkins, who is really has listened to his own calling now about bringing our awareness about this link between our core fears and our purpose. And for John, the root of many of our anxieties and the root of what can hold us back and stop us from taking risks is our fear of death. So today we're going to be talking about death. And of course, in the psychedelics world, which many of our ASA community are linked to or part of, death is really a prevalent topic because psychedelic experiences can show us about death. They can help us understand about death. They can help us almost have a practice run. We can experience ego death. We can experience the feeling of rebirth. And we can also gain some insight into what we think death might be like. We can also connect to loved ones who have passed. So death is an important aspect of psychedelic experiences. But it's not just psychedelic experiences, also near-death experiences share many features of psychedelic experiences. So our guest today, John Hopkins, thank you so much for being with us, John.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I'm so looking forward to hearing your story. I've heard it before because we both live in the same wonderful town of Frome in Somerset in the UK, this quite magical town full of interesting shamanic people and doulas of many types, of which you are one. And I would just love you to tell us your story about how your experiences have brought you to this place of really understanding the importance of looking death in the eye.
Thank you. Okay. So my fear of death experiences began, it's hard to kind of put a finger on it, but I think I was always really interested in why we're scared of death. I think I was always aware that we were living in a society that didn't particularly want to talk about it. You know, there's a brilliant man called Stephen Jenkinson, who's a very wise man and talks a lot about death. And he describes our society as being death phobic, which I think I agree with. Anyway, there was always this curiosity for me around death and the fear of death. And it was around 2015, I'm a filmmaker, well, I was a filmmaker, and I was writing a science fiction feature film that explored artificial intelligence. And by looking into artificial intelligence and the fear around that, because I was very aware, even 10 years ago, how scared everyone was becoming of this new invention. And that was kind of bringing up this kind of question about fear for me. And I was writing this film, and I had a kind of spiritual awakening by going down a rabbit hole into artificial intelligence, sort of forced me into looking into human consciousness more clearly. And ever since that moment, I suppose I've been on a kind of quest to explore the fear of death. I went on a retreat in 2018. It was an ayahuasca retreat that I did in the UK. And I remember being told by the guide there that there'll be a moment when you feel like you are able to ask a question. So that was put to us. And I remember thinking that felt quite sort of vague and quite sort of magical and not quite, I wanted a bit more sort of structure to that, but I just kind of trusted that this moment would arrive. And sure enough, there was a moment in my experience where I felt like I could ask a question, and I asked, and I'd written the question down, which was, and I think I've still got it on a pad somewhere, which is, should we be scared of death? And I remember asking this question into the kind of nothingness, as it were, and I was answered back immediately by myself in a kind of snap way. I wasn't expecting it, but it's like I had the answer to it myself. And that was a big moment for me. And it wasn't a sort of tipping point in terms of right now I've actually trained to become an end of life guide, but it was a bit later on, a few years later on, that I realized, looking back in life, that I'd had various sort of run-ins with death that I'd either forgotten about or hadn't really been taken very seriously. And I was experiencing some panic attacks actually about 2 years ago, because I set up and ran a business called Celestial, which is a aerial drone light display company. And the company was having a bit of a crisis moment, and it was causing me to have these sort of panic attacks in the night when I come home from work, because I was so kind of entangled and woven up into the business that any problems with the business became my kind of personal problems. And as I felt business was sort of dying at that time, I started to feel like I was dying, right? And I was having these panic attacks, and I was listening to a philosopher called Ram Dass every night to kind of calm me down. I was using his soothing words and wisdom to just sort of settle me down so I could go to sleep every night. And one of the things he kept saying, I realized, was that working with dying people was the highest work that he'd ever done. And so this was a light bulb moment for me, because I suddenly went, oh, wow, I've had these near-death experiences. Maybe I'm supposed to work with death. And at that moment, I felt my purpose coming at me like a rhino. And it was death. And I was like, oh my God, no, 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 no. That, I resisted with every ounce of my soul. I just didn't want it to be death. But it was so powerful that I had no option but just to kind of surrender into it. And it kind of washed over me. And I suddenly realized in that moment that my purpose had just deepened. Mm. And it was a double thing. I realized in that moment that death was something I needed to explore, and that I should really take that very seriously. And I went on to become an end-of-life guide or a death doula. Actually, the terminology is a soul midwife was the particular training I did. But it also gave me this idea that purpose is intertwined with death. Because in that moment of me discovering I should work in death was also a moment where my purpose deepened. So both of those things happened at the same time, which I thought was really interesting. And yeah, that was the beginning of me becoming a doula, but also sort of exploring this concept of death and purpose being part of the same spectrum.
Can you tell us what, I mean, it's such an amazing story as well, because I think how amazing to become a soul midwife, and how brave in terms of life direction, and how very different from your life experience. I imagine up until that point, it was a real departure and taking a very brave, and I imagine potentially kind of risky step off into the unknown. And I think, yeah, it's an incredible thing to really not only get a sense of your purpose, but commit to it in such a deep way, and actually choose for your life direction to totally change. And I'd love to hear about from your experiences so you've been sitting with people who are dying in hospitals.
Yes.
And which, again, I mean, there's a real courage in that. That's really, it's not just getting a sense of what you think your values might be or your life purpose is, but actually doing it. And so I would love to hear what are the main lessons you've learned from these experiences of sitting with people who are dying. I mean, many of us may have heard these, there are kind of tropes around, the things that people regret when they're dying, but I'd love to hear from you. What have you heard from people?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, firstly, I realized looking back on my career that I'd always essentially been building my career for me first. Um, I was a filmmaker, then I set up Celestial, and now I'm sort of embarking more down this path towards mortality and purpose. But there was a sort of beautiful flip when I finally sort of broke into this understanding that if I was more in service to others rather than just to myself, then, again, it's the purpose starts to deepen, and there's this kind of wonderful feeling of meaning that started to emerge for me in a way that I'd never experienced before. And so it was almost like the moment I started to smell and taste and sense that, I had no option really but to kind of follow that wholeheartedly. And then since I've been sitting with dying people, I've got a real sort of deeper gratitude for life. I mean, there's a lovely thing that Buddhist monks do. Most Buddhist monks, when they wake up in the morning, the first thing they do is meditate on their own death. So they'll spend 10, 15 minutes every morning kind of imagining themselves dying, right, in different ways every morning. So that when their morning then starts and they finish their meditation, they step into life, they step into that day with full gratitude for being alive. And I suppose all of these learnings for me made me realize that I think we live in the West where we take life for granted, right? We go through life because we don't talk about death, because death is taboo and swept under the carpet and is an inconvenient truth. We go through life taking life for granted. And as a result of that attitude, which is quite subtle, by the way, it's not like people are doing this spitefully with bitterness or anything like that. But because people are not aware of death and not acknowledging death, they therefore think there's a sort of feeling like I'm going to live forever. And as a result, we take life for granted. And as a result of that, we don't really look after ourselves very well or look after the planet. So this one core principle has seismic effects on all aspects of our society and how we make decisions and how we regulate ourselves as a culture. And tied into this is the fact that by not talking about death and acknowledging death, we foster the fear of it. So by not acknowledging it, the fear of death remains like strong, and it's a subliminal thing, this fear of death, because most people focus on what I call the auxiliary fears. So the fear of spiders, the fear of intimacy, the fear of heights, the fear of love, the fear of rejection, failure, whatever these fears are that create problems in our lives that we spend billions of dollars putting band-aids on all of these fears. But those fears grow out of the grandmother fear, which is the fear of death that nobody wants to talk about. So until we start talking about the grandmother fear, these auxiliary fears will remain. And these auxiliary fears dictate how we live our lives. And actually, what these auxiliary fears do is they create limiting beliefs for us. So they keep us small and they prevent us from taking risks because, I remember I always wanted to learn how to do backflips, but some little voice in the back of my mind told me, oh no, don't do that. It's a bit scary, right? And maybe if I'd tried it, I would have been in the Olympics doing backflips. But because that little voice of fear got the better of me, I never really gave that a go. And that's just an example of, many times in all our lives that little voices convince us not to try things, right? And so these fears chip away at us over time and essentially prevent us from discovering who we really are or discovering our purpose. Because if we didn't have those fears in our ears, we'd be trying new things. The more we try new things, the quicker we discover who we really are. And the quicker we discover who we really are, we intuitively and organically step on the path towards purpose in life.
Mm.
So it's all kind of like intertwined. And now that I've sort of spotted, I suppose, this logic from the work I've been doing, I'm now sort of committing myself wholeheartedly to addressing it and normalizing the conversation of death and actually almost using death, flipping death from something negative into something that could be super positive if we only just start talking about it. It can become the catalyst for us all to discover deep meaning in life and incredible fulfillment, satisfaction, and wealth in every form.
And courage too, because it's like, well, this is that whole idea of this is not a rehearsal, just do it, just try it. Like, how bad can it be if I fail? Just it's worse. That sense of it's better to try and to fail than to never try it. And this is my one chance, because if I don't do it now, I'm never going to do it. So just try. And how bad can it be if it doesn't, I wonder whether that kind of, you were talking about the backflips and that kind of, I think we just live in so much fear in our culture. I think we swim in the seas of fear. I mean, it's kind of all around us. And there's that sense of kind of what if, and these kind of worries. But sometimes when I really take that what if worry to the extreme of it, I mean, you talk about kind of, then you were having panic attacks with your business, with your drone, your beautiful light show, which I actually want you to talk a bit about at the end as well, because it's super amazing what you're doing there. But when you were, so tied to it and you were having those panic attacks and that fear of like, oh, if the company dies, I'm going to die. And I sometimes get fears about that. I mean, it's kind of when you're entangled with something and you just worrying, but then actually when you take it down to the extreme, I sometimes think, okay, so if this doesn't work, I've set up a company rather than staying in my traditional training. Okay, what if it doesn't work? Okay, well, what if this? And I take myself down to the very end where I'm like, what if I have to live in a tent in somebody's garden? And I'm like, what if I lose all my financial security and I end up living in a tent in a friend's garden? I'm like, it would be okay. We'd be okay if we were living in a friend's. We'd have our friends, we'd have our relationships, and there's something about I wouldn't die, coming back to that true sense of I wouldn't die, I'd still be alive. And that makes me realize that deep down, all of those fears come to survival. If I do this, is it going to limit my survival? And the reality is, in our society, survival's really hard. And actually, sometimes not surviving feels so close, because actually, it wouldn't be okay to do that. It would be really scary. So I feel that there's a fundamental vicious circle we get ourselves into in our society in the current times, which is because our lives are so precarious, genuinely so precarious, because there isn't much of a safety net. There isn't much support. There isn't much, especially in the States, not much of a sense of kind of a web that will hold you, and that things feel precarious. That fear is one of the reasons why we stay small in our lives, because it's a real fear. And there's something about facing the extent of it in the eye that will allow us to actually change the way we live and change our society and step out of that vicious cycle of a kind of uncaring society that feels precarious. To change that, we need to all be so linked to our power and our purpose and our sense of why we're here, and stepping up and out of our safety zone and out of watching Netflix and out of, you know, doing the things that feel comfortable and safe in order to change our society so that it doesn't feel so precarious for the next generation. But it's hard work. You know, it's like the times are calling us to be so incredibly brave that I've almost got to the point of it's only going to be facing death in the eye that's going to allow us to do it. What else is going to shake us out of our complacency?
No, I totally agree. And there's a really lovely Chinese proverb that says it's an honor to live in troubled times. And I take a lot of comfort from this saying, because essentially troubled times forces people to step out of their comfort zones and do something about the trouble. And what happens with that is a really beautiful thing, which is people step out of their bubbles, which often are the cages that keep people small and keep people from discovering who they really are. Because I think humans are designed because of our egos. When things become a little bit too comfortable, we become a bit lazy and we become a bit void, really, of like spirit. But when things become a bit dramatic and existential, as they are now, it forces the entrepreneurial spirit in people to emerge, right? And to start to blossom. And then you see generations of people waking up and like realizing that no one else is going to do anything about this. Maybe I need to do something. And the moment that sort of starts to happen in people, you see this beautiful emergence of bravery and entrepreneurial spirit come to the surface. And I think we're going to see this happen now. We're going to see a generation of people stepping up and stepping into their true selves and into their purpose in order to solve the problems that we need to solve right now. And it's very invigorating, I find, to be around people who are entrepreneurial. You know, it's people who aren't dependent on others to forge their own destiny, as it were. You know, I find that energy very invigorating to be around. And I think, yeah, it's that saying of that it's an honor then to be living in these dramatic times. There's something else I like to think about, which is there's a saying that, you know, we are the universe experiencing itself. And as a filmmaker who used to write kind of blockbuster movies with high stakes and high drama in the stories, I sometimes like to think of myself as the universe, and I'd go, well, if I'm the universe and I'm writing this story, would I want a really cozy, comfortable story where nothing dramatic ever happens? Or would I want something super dramatic, high stakes, very existential to happen in my story that makes it really exciting, you know, and it forces the heroes to wake up and do something about it.
Mm.
And sometimes I like to sort of think that, yes, this is exactly what's happening. We're in this very dramatic storyline, but that's exactly what the universe wants to happen, because
Mm.
it wants to experience a really exciting story, just what we
Turnaround.
do, right?
Turn around. We still have time for the great turnaround. Yes, it's the very last moment, isn't it? It's like the
Of
very
course
last
it is.
moment that things can shift, and we're at that moment of feeling like, is it gonna shift or is it just gonna
Yeah.
carry on? But holding on to that real sense of like, well, that was the other theme that I wanted to think with you about is in ASA, we talk a lot about living according to the codes of the forest. So it's slow, it's cyclical, it's interconnected and in balance. That's the way the forest grows. And cycles of death and rebirth are essential to a forest thriving. The tree will lose all of its leaves, the leaves turn into compost, they provide the rich nutrients for the new seed that's about to fall. But there's something about death and rebirth that feels like such an important theme right now as we feel our kind of important parts of our culture dying away. And at the moment, some of the death is quite violent in places. Many of our listeners are in America, and there is the composting of the old at the moment is feeling terrifying and existentially deeply threatening. And then I am holding on to this idea of, okay, things are composting in ways that we cannot understand, in ways that feel terrible sometimes, but there is also a new seed that is being dropped onto the compost of those old leaves, and something new is rising up. And as you say, galvanized by the intensity and the being pushed so far in one direction that things are going to spring back. And I'm holding on to that hope, but I think it can be harder to imagine. In a forest, you can predict the rebirth because every winter things die away, and then you know that every spring they're going to come back. But the timeline for humans and cultures is very different. So what would you say from your perspective about this moment that we're in, of kind of how can we, and maybe it links to something you said before when you had on that retreat and you were asked that question of like, should I be afraid of death? Is what was the answer, and what do we do about when we are looking death in the face, or the death of our culture, the death of parts of our culture, should we say, the death of some of our freedoms potentially, and we can't yet see the rebirth? How do we move into a place? What helps us move into a place where we can look it in the eye, and instead of being shut down by the fear because there's no guarantees, there's no certainty, what is it that we can hold on to that will give us the strength when there is no certainty, when we are facing the void, to step into it? What, from your experience, what can help us? Because for me, even though and I want to hear the answer to that question that your own intelligence told you of, like, should I be afraid of death? Because I'm still afraid of it. I'm still afraid of the nothingness.
Yeah. Wow, that's a big question. I'll do my best to answer.
Well, it's many questions. They're all huge.
I think whilst we still have egos, there will, the fear of death will never fully go. It's like, how much of it do we allow to take control of us, I suppose. We were built with egos which were designed to keep us alive. I think from a purely evolutionary point of view, the ego has been incredibly useful to get us to where we are now, as in terms of survival as a species. But weirdly, the ego is now presenting us, I think, the greatest blockage for our human evolution, because it's the ego that is essentially perpetuating this existential fear that's emerging. And the more we remain fearful, the more we kind of essentially pour petrol on the flames of our own destruction. Winding back to the question I asked in the retreat, the answer I very much got back was do not be scared of death. And I think, if you look into any religions, that message is very much front and center of all the teachings as well, But it's obviously, it's hard sometimes to remember all of this when you're consuming endless negative news that just feels like the world is, being flushed down the toilet. How to make people feel better about it. The only thing I think I can suggest, which is essentially the principle of the book I've just written and the newsletter I'm about to start releasing, is simply to start talking about death. The act of acknowledging it is the first step towards starting to control that fear. And at the moment, we live in a society where no one even wants to talk about it. We love talking about all the problems, all the horrors and everything, but we don't sort of acknowledge our own mortality in a way that sort of starts to address it. And, I mentioned the Buddhist monks doing that practice every morning. Can you imagine if everyone just did that every day? You just spent 5 minutes contemplating your own life, your own death. And the act of doing that then allows you that sense of gratitude for being alive. And the moment you start to bring that in is the moment you start to behave differently and think differently And if everybody could start doing that, then I think we start to see a shift in
Mm,
the need for this voracious consumption of negativity flipping into wanting actually more positivity. And I want to be surrounded by positivity in life. My time here is finite. I want to try things. I'm going to stop saying no to things. I'm going to start saying yes, and just sort of flipping the kind of cultural perspective around by the simple act of acknowledging mortality. And what I really like about this is it's, there's lots of us who are obsessed with diet and wellness and health and exercise and all of this. And, a lot of those practices require quite significant commitments. Just going to a yoga class is an hour, or, doing a fasting diet can be quite unpleasant sometimes. It might take weeks or months. You can just spend 5 minutes thinking about mortality in your own time, in your own space. You can just lie in bed when you wake up in the morning and do it. And it can start to have a significant impact on how we live our lives.
mm. I'm going to try doing that. And I think another invitation, thank you so much for that. It's so, yeah, I could feel my whole nervous system settle as there is something about facing it, talking about it, really bringing it in, and remembering that every day is a gift, and we don't know how many of those gifts, none of us ever know how many of these days we have. And they may feel challenging and too full of problems and stresses, but there is so much magic in this world, and there are so many wonderful people, and there are so many ways that we can bring something important to others. Like you said, that shift of going from a career and a life that was more focused on yourself to thinking about what you could bring to others. And I guess that's legacy. And I think that where you see in the forest, you see the trees drop their leaves and the compost for the new seed that will then fall. And the kind of human equivalent, although it's harder to see it than you see in the forest with trees, is legacy, is that idea of what we bring into our life. Connecting with our purpose isn't just about giving us that rejuvenation and that sense of joy and that sense of like being the flow state that you get to when you find your purpose. It's also about doing something that really matters for the next generation, for the people that come next, it can feel like a lot of pressure, this feeling of like, oh, what's my purpose? People often say when we get to our Apple month in August, which is all about finding purpose and kind of creativity, and people sometimes get quite stressed about the idea of having to do like an Apple project, like this idea of doing something that's really linked to your meaning and your values. But it sometimes is quite stressful. But I think this month in August, inspired by you, our Apple project, I'm going to invite people to sit with this idea of facing our fear in the eye, and what does that help us create? It doesn't have to be a huge life-changing thing, but what legacy, meaningful offering can that be when we imagine our own funeral, and imagine what people say, and imagine somebody there saying, that person helped me. And we don't have to do something huge. We don't have to leave our jobs and start this or start that. But being of a significant person to a younger person, saying something that changes their life. I know you were going to tell me earlier, and I'm going to ask you in a second, a quote from Alan Watts that really shifted your life purpose. But it's that kind of thing. It's like you can say something to somebody that helps them get more perspective. You can be there. You can be kind when someone is lost. And these are legacies. This is things that when we die, we will live on through those acts, and that's how the world changes too. So yeah, for our Apple month, we're going to ask you to come back, and you're going to be in the Q&A, so people in the ACER community can ask you their questions, and hopefully this conversation will sow some seeds, and hopefully people will have signed up to your newsletter as well, which we will put a link to, and will soon be live, so people can start hearing from you on a regular basis on the lead up to you publishing your book, and hearing more of your ideas, engaging with these themes, thinking more about our own death, maybe doing the meditation every morning. And then when we get to August, really to have developed brewed this idea a little bit, and be ready to say, in honor of this recognition of my death, I choose to do this thing. So we're looking forward to having you back in August for that. But you told me earlier in a conversation that there was a quote from Alan Watts, something Alan Watts said, which helped you become a soul midwife.
Well, it was the Ram Dass quote actually. Sorry, it was the one where he said, Ram Dass said, working with dying people was the highest work he'd ever done, and that
Mm,
was like this light bulb moment for me. Um, but it's funny you mentioned these quotes because something I'm doing in my book and in my newsletter, I'm going back through history and I'm finding that almost all of the most iconic thinkers in human history have at some point put on record a really beautiful quote about death and purpose. And so there's something, everyone from Socrates to Bob Marley to Abraham Lincoln, Marcus Aurelius, Oprah Winfrey's someone who's not is still alive with us, but like I'm going to put all of these quotes out for everyone to have a look at because once you see them all, they're all kind of saying the same thing and they're really inspirational. And the fact that all of these brilliant people have been talking about this forever just shows how, even though we're scared today, this is a human problem that's always existed because until death doesn't exist, we're always going to be confronted with the fear of death. But my favorite quote of all, I think, is from Carl Jung, and his quote really fuels everything I'm doing today. And his quote is, "Where your fear is, there is your task."
mm,
And it's very simple, but it's kind of that thing of like every time you're scared of something, rather than run away from it or try and fight it, go into it.
mm,
Don't run away from it. Actually, that's where we should be headed. Because what tends to happen is we're so scared of things, we run away from trying things or we fight whatever it is that we're scared of. Often, if you just step into it with a little bit of bravery, you discover it's not what you think it is. And
mm.
actually, there's real reward there that is very surprising. You don't know what it's going to be, but if you step into that fear, what I've experienced is you get rewarded in the most unexpected and miraculous ways.
Mm. That's so beautiful. Such an amazing quote. I hadn't heard that one yet, and it's so relevant to people who are using psychedelics for therapeutic purposes because that whole idea of meeting your fear. And so I don't know if you've heard of Bill Richards. He's an elder in the psychedelic therapy world, and he talks about, if you're going on a psychedelic experience, he worked with psilocybin with people with depression, and if you meet the dragon, dive into its mouth and ask what it has to show you. And that whole idea, and he gave us this mantra of in and through. So when you meet the fear, you go in it and you go through it and you say, yes, this is an opportunity to learn. So the whole idea around psychedelics is about helping facing our fears. And when you meet the scary dragons, knowing that that's going to take you towards the thing that you most need to learn.
Yes, absolutely. And for me, like this whole thing is a conversation about how can we get back in touch with our spirituality as well? Because, and I'm not talking about religion here, I'm just talking about a sort of universal spirituality. Because without a sort of sense of spirituality, the fear of death is only heightened. And
Mm.
if we can figure out a way to reintroduce spirituality into the mainstream, then that will inherently start to reduce our collective fear of death.
Yes. And so important at the moment to take that, to be able um to take that kind of like perspective. I think I get a bit lost in the weeds sometimes at the moment, engaging a lot with what's happening in the world, but kind of stepping up and finding that core connection to something greater, and
Mm,
that sense of trust
yeah,
is when I can find that place, it's enormously helpful. It's just about taking the time to connect with it and find it every day.
yes. Yeah. And the simplest thing you can do is just get out in nature, you know.
Yes.
Then you're
Yeah.
just surrounded by the cycles of life anyway. And there's that beautiful sense of knowing and trust that you're watching the cycles of life come and go, and that you're part of that. You're not alien to it, and that yes, you will live, but and you will die. And this is all part of this lovely cycles. And you know, there was something I read a year ago or something that, you know, we talk about going into the sixth mass extinction right now, but I think it was the first mass extinction, which was something like 258 million years ago. And something like 98% of all life on Earth died. But it all came back.
Yeah. Yes.
And, you know, I think we're so sort of obsessed with our own short lifespans that we
Yeah.
often forget to reflect about the greater lifespan of this planet, but also of the universe. You know, the universe is alive, and one day the universe will die too. You know, so we've got to kind of keep remembering that things live and die, and it's okay.
Yes, we did an event at the weekend, which was all about the idea of a forest that has been burnt by fire, coming back, rejuvenating, and how the seeds, even those just few seeds that are there remaining, coming back to life, and the mycelium underneath being this network, underground network of resilience that you can't really see it, but underground there's this incredible network that life will spring back from. So I think, yeah, I agree with you that going out into nature and surrounding ourselves with the cycles of death and rebirth, decay and rejuvenation all around us can really help with that sense of letting go of the ego mind and feeling part of nature and allowing these cycles to live in us. And maybe that's a really good way of helping to lessen the fear. Well, I feel inspired by hearing you, John, and I'm really inspired by your life path too, that it takes a lot of courage to step into this work. So I'm looking forward to having you back in August, and we can ask you more about your experiences as a soul midwife. And you'll, I'm sure, have lots of stories to tell us. And hopefully by that point, we will have been sitting with these thoughts, because they're big thoughts, they're big things to bring in. So we will have been letting them percolate down in the earth, and we will be starting to think about, maybe we will have been doing our meditation on death every morning and starting to think about, okay, in August, what am I going to grow from this? What am I going to look death in the eye, and when I look at that dragon, what beauty am I going to then be able to create, even if it's just very small, one thing. So thank you for the inspiration.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we will put a link to your newsletter into the notes for this, and when that's up and running, we will tell everyone about it so they can sign up. And in August, perhaps you can tell us more when you come for the Q&A about how people can get involved in your work. I know you have lots of amazing things planned, including well, we'll save it till August. You can tell us all about your plans, but some of your ideas are truly unique and creative and come from the mind of someone who's been a film director and working with drones, and this incredibly tech savvy kind of creative part of you, which you are bringing into the weave of what you're offering in your unique purpose, which you found through facing death. So thank you.
Thank you, Ros. Thank you so much.
And we'll see you in August. Have a good spring and summer too.
All right, you too. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that woodland walk and that there's some food for thought there. And if you're listening to this and you've been listening to these woodland walks for a while and you're wondering about the ACER community, please join us. It's a vibrant community full of warm-hearted, lovely, interesting people who are seeking to change their inner and outer worlds through a really beautiful, grounded, restorative, inspiring process linked to the wisdom of nature. People describe really looking forward to the workshops and the materials and listening to the tree journeys and feeling this slow process of becoming more grounded, more rooted. We talk about becoming more, be more tree. And there is something about the gentle resilience and the anchored feeling of being anchored to other people and standing tall for our values and turning the mud at our roots to the blossoms at our branches, and really doing that daily process of, well, we call it psychological photosynthesis, turning the mud to flowers, turning the hard life lessons into purpose, and bringing more more transformational power, the power of nature, the life force energy it can give us into ourselves to catalyze our relationships, our work in the world, and bring new skills for us to share with other people, our clients, our friends, our family. So join us. We're still taking applications for the next cohort that is beginning in April, which is going to be the introduction month. So it's absorbing the materials, engaging with the platform gently, learning how it works. And then our live workshops that happen in all time zones begin in May. We have a taster event on the 27th of March, where we will have a tree film and a tree journey. And the topic is super blooming in challenging times. So we hope you will join us for the taster event. If you haven't been to one of our tasters before, it really gives you a sense of what we're doing in our community. We're not just having these conversations. It's not just about the head, it's about the body. We are embodying these lessons every month. New lesson every month. We follow a new tree teacher, a new skill to bring into the very core of ourselves and to live in our lives and in our relationships. So join us for the taster event on 27th of March and have a look at our website to apply, and see you next month. Thank you for listening.